It always begins quietly, almost too quietly. Along the Kenya-Uganda border, people say that morning felt ordinary. The market stalls opened as usual, children played in the red dust, and long-distance trucks rumbled awake like they do every dawn. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing hinted at trouble, until a single voice crackled through an old radio sitting on a wooden counter, a sentence that sliced through the calm like an unexpected alarm. "That ocean belongs to me. In the future, we are going to have wars." Just one sentence. But for millions across East Africa, it felt like the ground shifted beneath their feet. A president speaking openly about future war, not metaphorically, not historically, but in the future. For older Kenyans and Ugandans who lived through the tense decades of the 1970s, who remember troops crossing borders and governments collapsing overnight, words like these are not political poetry. They are triggers. They reopen fears many hoped had been buried for good. And then, as if the universe wanted to test the region's nerves, only hours after that shocking statement, a Ugandan military delegation landed in Nairobi. No shots fired, no threats issued. Just crisp uniforms stepping off a military aircraft, entering closed-door meetings, and touring sensitive Kenyan bases. But for the average citizen watching the evening news, the image felt unmistakably symbolic. A president talks about war. His army arrives in the neighboring capital, and suddenly the air across East Africa feels a little heavier. So, what exactly is happening here? Is this an innocent coincidence? A quiet diplomatic mission wrapped in military clothing? Or is it a subtle reminder that the region's peace, its borders, its trade routes, even its access to the ocean can be shaken by a single sentence from a powerful man? If you care about East African stability, about the rising tensions shaping the future of the continent, and about how leadership, responsible or reckless, affects millions of ordinary lives, then stay with this story. Please share if you believe the world deserves to understand the truth behind these rising tensions. Subscribe if you believe that responsible leadership matters more than political headlines. For days after President Yoweri Museveni's now infamous words circled across East Africa, people in both Kenya and Uganda tried to make sense of what they had heard. It wasn't a policy statement. It wasn't a routine political comment. It was a declaration delivered calmly, almost casually, that the Indian Ocean belongs to Uganda and that in the future there would be wars over it. For ordinary citizens who depend on cross-border trade, shared roads, and decades of fragile peace, the remark felt like a spark dropped near dry grass. Museveni made the statement during a televised interview earlier in the week, repeating it multiple times to emphasize what he saw as a structural injustice, that landlocked countries like Uganda were, in his view, unfairly dependent on Kenya for seaport access. He expressed frustration at the endless negotiations, railways, pipelines, port agreements, each administration promising a solution, and each solution dissolving into bureaucracy. "That ocean belongs to me, because it is my ocean," he insisted, framing the issue not as a logistical problem, but as a question of national entitlement. Those listening, especially older Kenyans who had witnessed political instability in the region, immediately recognized the dangerous undertone. Africa has seen wars start over far less than trade disputes. And Museveni's statement made during a heated re-election campaign in Uganda, one he describes as his final term, had the unmistakable feel of political theater designed to rally nationalist sentiment. But even if intended for domestic consumption, the words did not stay within Uganda's borders. They raced across the internet, igniting reactions, interpretations, and fear. In Kenya, social media erupted. Many users condemned the comments as reckless, provocative, or disrespectful. Some called it a diplomatic insult. Others worried it signaled deeper tensions beneath the surface, tensions the public had not been fully aware of. Yet Museveni's supporters argued he meant it, metaphorically describing economic vulnerability rather than literal war. But metaphors carry heavy consequences when spoken by a head of state. What transformed this ordinary political controversy into a regional alarm, however, was what happened next. Only hours after Museveni's statement went viral, a Ugandan military delegation landed in Nairobi for what Kenya Defense Forces described as a benchmarking exercise. It was officially a routine visit, part of Defense Forces Welfare Services, DFWS, a program focused on improving soldiers' welfare and the well-being of military families. But the timing so close to the president's war-laced comments was impossible to ignore. The delegation was led by Major General Francis Takirwa, Deputy Commander of Uganda's Land Forces. Their schedule was extensive and unusually high-profile for a welfare visit. They toured Moi Air Base in Eastleigh, held closed-door meetings with senior Kenyan officers, and visited multiple DFWS facilities, including the DFWS Mall and headquarters in Embakasi. Cameras captured their movements, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. For analysts, the contradiction was striking. Museveni spoke of war. His army arrived for friendship. To the average person on the street, that contrast was confusing. But to those familiar with African geopolitics, it represented the oldest and most delicate dance in diplomacy, the ability to project strength while signaling cooperation to raise a threat with one hand and extend a handshake with the other. Inside Kenya's defense circles, the visit was handled with caution. There was no hostility, but there was alertness. Kenya welcomed the delegation, but no one pretended the moment was ordinary. Military cooperation continued as scheduled, but the atmosphere was heavier than usual, shaped by the weight of the president's earlier remarks. Even as Ugandan officers walked through Kenya's military compounds, the central question lingered. Was this visit meant to calm tensions, test reactions, or send a subtle message that Uganda's military presence could appear anywhere, anytime, even in the heart of Nairobi? This was the main event, a paradox unfolding in real time. Words of war, acts of diplomacy, and a region caught between the two. The moment of true escalation did not come from a battlefield, a border skirmish, or even an official government statement. It came from a realization, a collective shock shared almost simultaneously across Kenya. The Ugandan army had arrived in Nairobi only hours after President Museveni warned of future wars over access to the Indian Ocean. For an entire region that has lived through coups, invasions, and sudden diplomatic fractures, the timing alone felt like a lightning strike. This was the climax, the point at which the conversation stopped being about mere words and became a question of intent. As photos and footage of the Ugandan military delegation circulated online, the Kenyan public's reaction shifted from confusion to alarm. Commentators, political analysts, and ordinary citizens began to ask the same uncomfortable question. Was this a coincidence, or was Uganda sending a coded message under the guise of cooperation? Political talk shows lit up with debates. Veteran analysts reminded viewers that East Africa's stability has historically been fragile, often shaped not by official statements, but by subtle diplomatic moves and military gestures. Many pointed out that for a president to speak about war and then dispatch senior officers across the border suggested either a drastic miscommunication or a carefully choreographed strategy. One statement from a Kenyan security expert captured the mood perfectly. When a head of state talks of war and his army walks into the neighbor's capital, no one can afford to pretend it means nothing. Inside Kenya's military establishment, the response was measured but tense. Officers greeted their Ugandan counterparts with professionalism, but every step was observed with heightened caution. Internal briefings emphasized the need for vigilance. Intelligence units monitored the delegation's activities closely, ensuring no part of the visit diverged from the declared welfare mission. Yet the diplomacy continued. The Ugandan officers held a courtesy call with Major General Bernard Waliaula, the commander of the Kenya Air Force. The discussions at least officially focused on institutional learning and the enhancement of soldiers' welfare, hardly controversial topics. General Waliaula encouraged the Ugandan team to adapt Kenya's welfare model to improve conditions for troops back home. Polite smiles were exchanged. Cameras recorded handshakes. Everything appeared normal. But beneath the surface, everyone knew this wasn't normal. The emotional core of this moment lay in the contradiction. Even as Museveni's rhetoric ignited political tension, his army was quietly reinforcing military-to-military cooperation. This created a dual narrative, one public and incendiary, one private and stabilizing. Analysts described it as quiet diplomacy in camouflage, a form of strategic reassurance disguised as routine collaboration. The Kenyan government eventually broke its silence. On November the 12th, Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs Korir Shingwai addressed the media, insisting that Museveni's comments had been misunderstood and pulled out of context. He emphasized that the president was speaking metaphorically about economic constraints, not literal conflict. It was an attempt to calm panic, reassure investors, and prevent diplomatic fallout. But even with that explanation, the atmosphere did not fully relax. Political scientists highlighted that Museveni's remarks came during a tense election season in Uganda, suggesting he might be leveraging nationalist sentiment to strengthen his domestic support base. Yet they also warned that such rhetoric can have real regional consequences. Kenya and Uganda, despite decades of cooperation, have experienced moments of strained disputes over trade routes, fuel pipelines, and customs regulations. A verbal threat, even if metaphorical, pours gasoline on unresolved tensions. Older East Africans who remember the historical clashes, Uganda-Tanzania in the late 1960s, the Saba-Saba conflict in the 1970s, felt a wave of unease. Memories resurfaced. Wars usually begin with words, and sometimes nations ignore those words until it's too late. In the days following the delegation's visit, a new awareness settled over the region. Peace in East Africa hangs on delicate threads, and the line between diplomacy and danger can blur in an instant. This was the climax where uncertainty peaked, reactions hardened, and every gesture carried more weight than it seemed. Long after the Ugandan officers returned home and the Kenyan government issued its careful clarification, the shockwaves continued to ripple through both societies. For ordinary citizens, farmers, traders, drivers, families, the remark about future wars was not an abstract political idea. It was personal. It carried weight. And it reshaped how people viewed their safety, their economies, and their leaders. In border towns like Busia and Malaba, the first consequence was fear, quiet but palpable. These communities depend on the daily flow of goods between Kenya and Uganda. A single hint of tension can slow trucks, delay customs, and choke off livelihoods within hours. Drivers began telling local reporters they feared sudden checks or retaliatory delays. Market vendors whispered about rising prices if relations worsened. Even without troops mobilizing, anxiety alone was enough to disrupt life. Inside Uganda, the political consequences took a different shape. Museveni's supporters defended his remarks passionately, arguing that a landlocked country has every right to demand fair access to the sea. They framed him as a strong leader defending national dignity. And because Uganda is in an election season, the comment resonated powerfully with voters frustrated by decades of dependency on Kenya's infrastructure. But not all Ugandans agreed. Critics warned that such rhetoric risks isolating the country and provoking unnecessary tensions. Older Ugandans, especially those who lived through the disastrous clashes with Tanzania in the 1960s and 1970s, recalled how their nation suffered the most. They urged caution, reminding younger generations that war, even metaphorical talk of war, has consequences far beyond political theater. In Kenya, the political fallout reverberated through parliament and the media. Lawmakers questioned the wisdom of remaining silent for too long. Some demanded a stronger diplomatic response. Others advised restraint to avoid inflaming the situation. For Kenya, a country positioning itself as a regional economic anchor, the challenge was balancing firmness with stability. Any misstep could send negative signals to investors, trade partners, and neighboring governments. There was also a quieter, more subtle consequence, a shift in how East Africans evaluate leadership. Museveni's remark pushed many Kenyans to re-examine their own officials' ability to respond swiftly to external pressure. It also reignited discussions about regional unity or the lack of it. If leaders can unsettle entire border communities with one sentence, what does that say about the fragility of East African cooperation? Civil society organizations stepped in quickly. Human rights groups and peace institutes issued statements urging de-escalation and responsible communication. Academics published op-eds warning that careless rhetoric can trigger market shocks, hostile political narratives, or diplomatic retaliation. For them, Museveni's comment was not a domestic political gimmick, it was a regional security threat. Even the Ugandan military delegation's visit, though peaceful, carried consequences. It highlighted just how intertwined the two nations truly are economically, politically, militarily. The welfare programs, the shared training, the collaborative structures all revealed something that many ordinary citizens had forgotten. Despite political tension, Uganda and Kenya cannot function in isolation. Their stability depends on each other. And that is why the president's words were so unsettling. They contradicted the reality of interconnectedness. They revived ghosts of past conflicts. And they exposed the delicate balance that holds East Africa together. Across both nations, one truth became clear: in regions with fragile histories, the civil and political consequences of a single sentence can last far longer than the news cycle. From thousands of miles away in Washington, Brussels, and New York, the words exchanged between Uganda and Kenya did not go unnoticed. Global powers may not always react publicly to African political tensions, but they monitor them closely, especially when they involve regional stability, trade routes, and military movements. For the United States, Kenya is one of its most significant partners in East Africa. Nairobi plays a central role in counterterrorism, cooperation, maritime security, and humanitarian logistics in the Indian Ocean region. Any suggestion of conflict, literal or metaphorical, between Kenya and a neighboring country raises serious questions in American strategic circles. Not because the U.S. fears a war tomorrow, but because such rhetoric disrupts the delicate stability that American planners rely on for long-term regional policy. Washington's analysts would have parsed Museveni's statement carefully. A claim that Uganda is entitled to the Indian Ocean might be political posturing, but it also reveals frustration with regional logistics and infrastructure issues the U.S. has long encouraged African nations to address collaboratively. And the phrase "in the future we are going to have wars" is one no American diplomat can ignore, no matter the intended meaning. The arrival of Uganda's military delegation in Nairobi likely triggered additional attention among intelligence services. Publicly, the visit was harmless, focused on soldier welfare and institutional learning. But analysts understand that optics often matter as much as substance. A president speaks of war. Hours later, his officers land in the neighboring capital. To global observers, timing like that is never purely accidental. Even if unintentional, it becomes symbolically loaded. In Europe, similar concerns would have emerged. The European Union views East Africa as a critical partner for trade, migration, cooperation, and climate security. Instability in the region threatens not only local peace, but also international shipping lanes that pass through the western Indian Ocean. A dispute over ocean access, even rhetorical, is enough to set off quiet diplomatic inquiries. China, another major actor in the region, would also pay close attention. Beijing finances infrastructure across both Uganda and Kenya, railways, highways, and energy projects. Any suggestion of rising tensions threatens those investments. Chinese diplomats may not speak publicly, but internal assessments would immediately question whether Museveni's comment signals deeper frustrations with regional economic integration. Across the African continent, leaders watched with equal concern. Many understand how easily misunderstandings can escalate in regions with fragile histories. Some would have viewed Museveni's words as a warning sign of election season nationalism. Others might see them as symptomatic of unresolved economic grievances among landlocked African nations. In either case, the incident underscored the vulnerability of regional blocs like the East African Community, EAC, which already struggles with cohesion and shared purpose. What stands out most to international observers is the duality of the moment. On one hand, Museveni's rhetoric ignited alarm. On the other, Uganda's military delegation worked calmly and professionally, with Kenyan officers demonstrating long-standing cooperation. This contradiction, the threat of conflict contrasted with acts of partnership, captures the complexity of modern African geopolitics. Words travel faster than intentions, and in a world interconnected through media, timing becomes a form of diplomacy. For the global community, the incident served as a reminder: East Africa's peace is not guaranteed. It must be safeguarded, respected, and reinforced not just by African nations, but by the world powers that rely on the region's stability. When the dust finally settled and the news cycle moved on, the ordinary people of East Africa were left with the same quiet question they felt on the day the radio first crackled with Museveni's words: what happens next? Because beneath all the statements, explanations, handshakes, and diplomatic language, one truth remained impossible to ignore: peace in this region can be shaken not by armies, but by a single sentence spoken at the wrong time. In towns along the Kenya-Uganda highway, truck drivers still talk about that week with a nervous laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to hide real fear. Mothers in Kampala still wonder why their president chose such dramatic language. Farmers in Western Kenya still recall how the markets reacted, how prices shifted just from uncertainty alone. And older East Africans, those who remember the conflicts of the 1970s, say they felt a familiar chill in the air. Because history has taught them something many younger generations have never lived through: wars don't start with bullets. They start with words. Museveni's remark, whether metaphorical or not, forced the region to confront that uncomfortable reality once again. And the swift arrival of the Ugandan military delegation in Nairobi, peaceful though it was, showed how timing can turn an ordinary event into a geopolitical signal. But there is another truth hidden beneath this tension, a truth many global observers noticed: East Africa is deeply interconnected. Its trade routes, its soldiers, its roads, its families. A disruption in one country ripples into all the others, and that is why the world reacted the way it did. Washington, Brussels, Beijing all looked closely, understanding that the stability of this region affects far more than its own borders. For many viewers following Africa news today, the episode also raises a broader question about leadership across the continent. They think of rising figures like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, leaders whose words carry weight far beyond their own nations, leaders whose every statement can inspire hope or ignite fear. And they wonder, what kind of leadership does Africa need in this era of fragile alliances and shifting power? More importantly, can East Africa maintain unity when a single misinterpreted phrase can shake public confidence? These are not questions for governments alone. They are questions for citizens, for observers around the world, and for anyone who believes that peace should never rest on fragile ground. So let me ask you directly, do you think leaders should be held accountable for every word they speak, especially when those words can unsettle millions? Do you believe East Africa is moving toward greater stability or toward deeper uncertainty? Your perspective matters, especially now. Please share this video if you believe ordinary people deserve to understand the truth behind diplomatic tensions. And subscribe if you believe that responsible leadership matters more than political headlines.